The moment Alma Underwood stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, three different people warned her about Roy Blackwell before she had even collected her trunk from the luggage boot. The first was old Chester Gaines, the stagecoach driver, who leaned down from his perch with a weathered face full of genuine concern, and told her that if she was heading to the Blackwell Ranch for the housekeeper position, she ought to reconsider before the dust from the road had even settled on her boots. The second was a woman named Delphine Holt, who ran the dry goods store on the main street and came outside to watch the stage arrive, as she apparently did every Tuesday and Thursday, and who pressed her lips together in a thin line when Alma asked for directions to the Double B Ranch. The third was a boy of perhaps 12 years, barefoot and gap-toothed, who simply shook his head slowly when he heard the name and said, with the grave certainty of a child who has absorbed the opinions of every adult around him, that Roy Blackwell was not a man who ought to have a woman working anywhere near him. Alma, who was 24 years old, who had buried her mother 6 months prior in Albuquerque and sold everything they owned to cover the debts left behind, and who had exactly $1.32 left in the small cloth purse tucked inside her traveling coat, thanked all three of them politely and asked again for directions to the Double B Ranch. She had not come all this way to be frightened off by rumors. The advertisement she had answered had been straightforward and businesslike. A ranch housekeeper was needed, room and board included, wages paid monthly. It had not said the rancher was a pleasant man. It had not promised companionship or warmth or any kind of comfort beyond shelter and a salary. It had been posted in the Albuquerque paper by a man named Garrett Foss, who turned out to be Roy Blackwell's ranch foreman, and it had been the most honest advertisement Alma had read in weeks of searching. She had written back immediately. The road to the Double B was 4 miles out of town, following a dirt track that wound through scrub cedar and dry yellow grass until it opened onto a wide flat stretch of land where the horizon seemed to go on forever in every direction. The ranch itself was visible from a distance, a cluster of buildings that looked solid and well-maintained, far more so than she had expected given the stories she had already collected. The main house was 2 stories of whitewashed timber with a long front porch. There was a proper barn, 2 outbuildings, a water tower, and a bunkhouse set back at a respectful distance from the main residence. Garrett Foss met her at the gate. He was a lean man in his late 40s with a face like dried leather and calm, observant gray eyes, and he shook her hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had very little time and used every bit of what he had. "Miss Underwood," he said. "Glad the stage was on time for once. I'll show you the house and go over the work. Mr. Blackwell is out on the North Range and won't be back until supper. Is there anything I should know before I meet him?" Alma asked, keeping her voice entirely neutral. Garrett Foss looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes, and something shifted in his expression that was too complicated to read cleanly. It might have been sympathy. It might have been a kind of careful respect. "He is a hard man," Garrett said. "He expects things done properly and on time. He does not make small talk, and he does not appreciate being asked about his business or his past. He is not cruel to animals or to people who do their work honestly. If anyone in town told you otherwise, you can weigh that against what I just said." He left it there and showed her inside. The house was clean but cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, because the late April afternoon was warm and bright. It was the cold of a place where nobody had bothered in a long time. The kitchen was functional and well supplied. The main sitting room had good furniture with thick dust on every surface. There were curtains on the windows, but they were drawn against the light, and the whole downstairs felt like a house that had quietly given up on the idea of being a home. Alma set her trunk down in the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, took off her traveling coat, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. She had beaten 3 rugs, cleaned the kitchen floor, restocked the woodbox beside the iron stove, and started a pot of stew before she heard horses in the yard at the end of the day. She heard boots on the porch steps, the door swinging open, and then silence. She came out of the kitchen into the narrow hallway and saw Roy Blackwell for the first time. He was tall, somewhere between 30 and 35, with broad shoulders that filled the door frame and dark hair that was cut short and slightly damp at the temples from a long day under his hat. He had a square jaw that held a few days of dark stubble, and eyes that were a deep, complicated brown, the kind of brown that looked almost black in low light. He was dusty from the range, his work clothes worn and practical, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite suspicion, but contained elements of both. "You are the housekeeper," he said. "Alma Underwood," she said. "Yes, sir. I arrived this afternoon. Mr. Foss showed me around." A pause. His eyes moved briefly to the hallway behind her, to the absence of dust on the side table that had been invisible under a gray film this morning. "You have been busy," he said. "There is stew on the stove," she told him. "I hope that is acceptable. I can serve whenever you are ready." He said nothing else. He hung his hat on the peg beside the door, walked past her toward the back of the house where she presumed he washed up, and that was the entirety of their first meeting. She served supper. He ate at the head of the long kitchen table without speaking. She stayed busy at the stove so that the silence did not become awkward, and when he finished he pushed back his chair and said, without looking up, "It is good." Alma decided that was progress. The first week was a careful, quiet education in Roy Blackwell and his habits. He rose before dawn and was already out of the house before she had the stove going each morning. He came in for the noon meal if he was working close to the home buildings and did not if he was out on the range. And in that case, Garrett brought food out to wherever the men were working. He returned at the end of the day, washed up, ate whatever she put in front of him with the same contained efficiency, and retired early. He did not raise his voice. He did not make unkind comments about her cooking or her work. He did not treat her with anything approaching cruelty. But he was absolutely, thoroughly closed. There was a wall around Roy Blackwell that was so complete and so long established that Alma suspected even he had stopped noticing it was there. She asked Garrett about it carefully during the second week, when they were both in the barn and she was trying to figure out why the good cast iron pot had been stored in the tack room rather than the kitchen. Garrett handed her the pot without asking how it had come to be there and said, "His wife died 3 years back. Fever took her in the winter." Alma received this quietly. "Were they married long?" "4 years," Garrett said. He picked up a bridle he had been mending and did not look at her. "Her name was Clara. She was a good woman. He took it badly. Men take things badly in different ways. Some drink, some get loud. Roy got quiet. That wall you see now, that is 3 years of getting quiet." Alma thought about this for several days. She did not try to break the wall because she was not there to break anything. She was there to do her work, earn her wages, and rebuild some kind of footing for herself after the wreckage of the last year. But she was naturally a warm person, and warmth has a way of occupying a cold space simply by existing in it. She started opening the curtains in the front room in the mornings. The first day she did it, Roy came in at noon for lunch and stopped in the doorway of the sitting room for a moment, looking at the way the light fell across the wooden floor. He said nothing. He went and ate. The second day, she left the curtains open and also set a small jar of desert flowers on the windowsill, yellow and stubborn-looking things she had found growing along the fence line. He paused again in the doorway. Still nothing. The third day she was dusting in the sitting room when he came in at noon, and she saw his gaze go straight to the flowers before going anywhere else. He caught her watching him notice them, and something passed across his face very briefly, something that looked almost like being caught doing something private. "They will not last long," he said. "Cut flowers in a jar." "A few days is worth something," she said, "even if it does not last forever." He looked at her for a slightly longer beat than usual. Then he went to the kitchen. She counted it as the first real thing they had said to each other. It was in the third week that she saw the letter. She had not been snooping. That point mattered to her enormously. She had been cleaning the small study off the sitting room, a room that Roy apparently used for the ranch's accounts and correspondence, and she had been dusting the bookcase when a book slid sideways and knocked a box from the shelf above. The box fell and the lid came off and several items scattered across the floorboards. She knelt to gather them: a pocket watch with a cracked face, a small photograph in a tin frame, a man's ring, and an envelope sealed, addressed in a hand she did not recognize to someone named James Aldridge in San Antonio, Texas. She picked up the envelope carefully, meaning only to return it to the box. She had no intention of examining it, but she could see, even without trying, that the envelope was addressed but had no postal cancellation. It had never been sent. It had been written, sealed, and kept in a box on a shelf, perhaps for years. She set it in the box with everything else and replaced the box on the shelf. She finished cleaning the study and went back to the kitchen, and she thought about that envelope for the rest of the day in a low, quiet way. The way you think about something that has moved you without being able to say exactly why. She was thinking about it that evening when she passed the study door on her way from the kitchen to her room, and she saw that the door, which had been closed all day, was now slightly ajar. There was the faint orange glow of the lamp from inside. She nearly kept walking. She would have kept walking except for the sound. It was quiet enough that she almost missed it entirely. A rough, uneven sound that a man makes when he is trying very hard not to make any sound at all. Alma stopped. She stood in the hallway with her hand at her side and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She looked at the thin line of lamplight at the edge of the door. Roy Blackwell was weeping. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the controlled, painful way of a man who had not wept in a very long time and was now doing it badly, like a skill you forget when you do not use it. She could hear him trying to keep it inside and failing in small, broken increments. She stood there for a long moment. Every instinct she had told her to walk away, to give him the privacy that a man like him guarded more fiercely than anything he owned. But another part of her, the part that had sat with her mother in those last weeks and learned the hard way that suffering alone is the cruelest kind of suffering, would not let her simply leave. She lifted her hand and knocked softly on the door frame. Twice, silence, a sharp, caught silence. "Mr. Blackwell," she said very quietly, "I am going to make some coffee. The kitchen will be warm." She did not wait for an answer. She walked to the kitchen, stoked the stove, and put the coffee on. She set 2 cups on the table. She sat down and waited. 8 minutes passed. She was counting, not consciously, but the way you do when you are waiting for something and the silence has weight. The kitchen door swung open and Roy Blackwell came in. His eyes were red at the rims. His jaw was set with an effort that she recognized as the deliberate reconstruction of a face that had come apart, just slightly, just around the edges. He looked at the 2 cups on the table. He looked at her. He sat down. She poured the coffee. She did not say anything. The stove ticked and the lamp on the table threw steady yellow light across the oilcloth, and outside the window the New Mexico night was immense and full of stars. After a long time he said, "You heard." "I heard you were troubled," she said. "That is all I heard." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His hands were large and scarred in the minor, accumulated way of a man who worked with rope and timber and livestock, and they were not quite steady. He stared into the cup. "I found a letter I had written," he said. "She waited. Before Clara died. When she was sick and I did not yet know she was going to die, I wrote to her brother in San Antonio, James Aldridge. He and Clara had a falling out before we married, over money, or so she said. The real reason was something older and more complicated. She had not spoken to him in 4 years. He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked once. I wrote to tell him she was ill. I thought it might be the thing that repaired what was broken between them. I thought she should not face what she was facing without her family. But you never sent it," Alma said. "I put it in the box thinking I would decide in the morning, whether it was my right to intervene, whether she would want me to." His voice was very controlled, but underneath it there was something raw and exhausted. "She died 3 days later, before I could decide." The silence stretched between them again, but it was a different kind of silence than usual. It had texture to it. "You have been carrying that for 3 years," Alma said. He looked up at her for the first time since he had come into the kitchen. His eyes were still red, but they were fully present, fully focused on her face with an intensity that she felt like something physical. "I opened the box this evening by accident," he said, "looking for the ledger book. The letter was on top." "Did you read it?" "Yes." She waited. "It was a good letter," he said, and his voice fractured very briefly before he controlled it again. "I had forgotten that I could write like that, that I knew how to say things like that." Alma set down her coffee cup and looked at him steadily. "You could still send it," she said. "It has been 3 years, but James Aldridge is still her brother. He does not know she is gone, most likely. He might want to know. He might need to know for his own reasons." Roy looked at her for a long time. "It is not that simple. Most true things are not," she agreed. "I did not say it would be easy. I said it might be worth doing." He said nothing else that night. He finished his coffee, thanked her for it in a way that was slightly different from how he usually thanked her for things, a shade more personal, more direct, and went to bed. But the next morning, when Alma came into the kitchen to start breakfast, she found the kitchen table empty except for the coffee she had left covered on the stove. And on the front hall table, ready to go to town, was the sealed envelope addressed to James Aldridge in San Antonio, Texas. Alma looked at it for a moment. She pressed her lips together against a smile that she did not want to be seen having, and she started breakfast. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the first ones. Not dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to as a single moment of change. It was more like a window being opened, very gradually, letting in air that had not been inside for a long time. Roy began to stay at the kitchen table after supper rather than retiring immediately. At first, he brought the ranch ledger and worked at the table while she cleaned up, which was not quite company but was adjacent to it. Then one evening the ledger was not there, and he was simply sitting with his coffee, and when she made a dry observation about the fact that the rooster had figured out how to get up onto the water tower, he laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, as if laughter had caught him off guard. But it was real. It settled into the kitchen like light. "He has been getting up there for 2 weeks," Roy said. "I keep waiting for him to figure out he cannot get down and finally have some sense knocked into him." "He seems committed to his position," Alma said, hanging her dish towel on the hook. "He is the stubbornest animal on the property," Roy said, "including the mule." "High praise," she said. He smiled. Not a big smile, not yet, but a real one that reached his eyes and changed the whole geography of his face. That was the evening she understood, quietly and without ceremony, that she was in some degree of danger with regard to Roy Blackwell. Not the danger the town had warned her about, an entirely different kind. She did not let herself linger on it. She was a practical woman by nature and by necessity, and she had enough clear-eyed sense to know that a lonely woman who had come to a lonely man's house was not in the best position to trust her own feelings. She worked. She tended the house. She baked on Fridays because she had discovered that Roy had a particular weakness for anything involving molasses. A discovery she made because the tin of molasses in the pantry was the only one that had been regularly and carefully used while everything else gathered dust. She started going into town for supplies every 2 weeks, driving the buckboard herself because Garrett always had work and Roy was always on the range. Harlan Creek was a small town of perhaps 300 souls, settled around a creek that ran reliably enough most years and a main street of board-front buildings that included the dry goods store, a saloon, a church, a bank, and a small hotel. Delphine Holt, who ran the dry goods store, had warmed to Alma over time in the cautious way of a small-town woman warming to an outsider, and one afternoon in late May, while Alma was placing her order, she said, without quite meeting Alma's eyes, "How are things out at the Double B, if you do not mind my asking?" "Fine," Alma said. "Busy. The spring calves are coming in well." Delphine nodded. She was quiet for a moment, wrapping the order in brown paper with practiced hands. "Roy Blackwell was not always what he is now, you know," she said. "Before Clara died, he was not a laughing man, not exactly, but he was not cold either. He was fair. He helped people. When Martin Coates lost his barn to fire in the winter of '74, Roy sent 2 men and lumber without being asked." She paused. "Grief changes a man, sometimes permanently." "Sometimes not permanently," Alma said. Delphine looked at her then, a searching look that Alma met calmly. "You are doing him good," Delphine said, not unkindly but with a directness that acknowledged they both understood what was being said. "Whatever you are doing out there, it is doing him good. Hector Vance saw him in town last week and said he nodded at him on the street. Roy has not nodded at Hector in 3 years." Alma took her packages and said, "He is a man who needed reminding that the world still existed. That is not a complicated thing." But of course it was a complicated thing. She knew it was complicated on the drive home, watching the scrub cedar give way to the wide open land of the Double B, watching the white house come into view on the flat with the sky enormous and cloudless above it. She was falling in love with Roy Blackwell. She had been falling in love with him, she suspected, since the evening he sat down at the kitchen table and drank coffee in the dark, and she had managed to talk herself out of naming it this long by keeping busy and staying practical. But there it was, on the flat road in the afternoon light, plain as the horizon. It was an inconvenient thing to feel for a man who had loved his wife with the kind of depth that left scars 3 years deep. She kept it to herself and kept working. It was in early June that Roy came to her with a question. He came to the kitchen door at midday, which was unusual because he was supposed to be out on the south pasture. She was rolling out pastry dough and looked up at the sound of his boots on the step. "I need to go to Santa Fe," he said. "I have business at the land office that cannot wait and a meeting with the bank. It will be 3 days, possibly 4. Would you be comfortable here with Garrett and the men?" "Of course," she said. "Is everything all right with the ranch?" He came inside and leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed, a posture she had come to recognize as his version of settling in for a real conversation rather than a brief one. "There is a water rights dispute developing," he said. "My neighbor to the east, Terrence Webb, has been diverting water from the creek that runs along our shared boundary. I have the original survey and the land grant that establishes my rights, but I need someone at the land office to look at the documents and give me a formal ruling before Webb does something I cannot undo." Alma kept rolling her dough. "Is Webb a difficult man?" Roy was quiet for a moment. "Webb is a man who believes that having money is the same thing as being right, which makes him predictable at least. What does he want with the water? He is building out, buying cattle, expanding his operation. The creek water matters for the pasture he wants to use on his east side. The problem is that water belongs to the Double B and has for 15 years, and Webb knows it." "Do you have documentation of that?" "I do. That is what I am taking to Santa Fe." She set down her rolling pin and looked at him directly. "You will win it," she said. "If you have the documents and the law on your side, you will win it." He looked at her with that steady, complicated gaze. "You sound very certain for someone who knows nothing about territorial water law." "I am certain of you," she said, and she said it simply and naturally because it was true, and then immediately recognized that it was exactly the kind of thing she had told herself not to say, because it crossed a line she had been carefully maintaining. A silence fell. Roy looked at her. Something moved through his eyes that she could not quite read, something warm and startled and cautious all at once. "I will be back by Thursday," he said. His voice was slightly different. Not colder, but more deliberate, as if he was being careful. "Garrett has his instructions. There is enough wood in the box to last the week." He left for Santa Fe the next morning. The 3 days he was gone were the longest Alma had spent at the Double B, which surprised her, because she had spent plenty of solitary days before he had started staying at the kitchen table in the evenings. She worked as hard as she always did, and told herself firmly that missing his presence was simply a matter of routine being disrupted. On the second evening without him, she found herself in the sitting room with a book she was not actually reading, looking at the jar of fresh desert flowers she had put on the windowsill that week. They were purple ones this time, some kind of desert verbena that grew along the creek. She was thinking about what Garrett had said in the barn those weeks ago, about Roy getting quiet, about the wall that grief builds. She thought about the letter. She had never asked Roy whether he had received a reply from James Aldridge. It had been 2 months since he sent it. A reply from San Antonio would take at least 2 weeks, possibly more, depending on the postal route. She did not know whether one had come and Roy had kept it to himself, or whether one had not come at all. She thought about what it must have cost Roy to send that letter. 3 years after his wife died. To acknowledge, in ink, to a man who had not spoken to Clara in 4 years, that she was gone, that the chance at reconciliation he had been trying to offer had expired long before the letter arrived. She understood, sitting in the lamplight with her unread book, that Roy Blackwell was a man of enormous and carefully unexpressed feeling, that the wall was not absence of feeling but the opposite, that all of it was still in there, compressed and maintained and managed, and that even one small opening in that wall let out a kind of warmth that could fill a house. She had been doing that, she realized, opening him inch by inch without meaning to. He came back from Santa Fe on Thursday afternoon, as he had said, riding in on his gray horse with the dust of the road on him, and a look of tired satisfaction on his face that told her before he said a word that the business at the land office had gone well. "The ruling was in my favor," he said at supper, cutting into the roast she had made in anticipation of his return. "Webb is not going to like it, but his lawyer made a poor argument and the surveyor's documents are unambiguous." "I told you," Alma said. He looked up from his plate with something that was becoming, gradually and unmistakably, a familiar expression between them, the ghost of a smile. "You did," he said. "Will Webb accept it? He will have no choice. If he continues diverting the water, I have legal grounds to compel him to stop, and the land office will back me." He cut another piece of roast. "He will be angry for a while. Webb is a man who stays angry, but he is not stupid enough to fight a losing battle in court." "Good," she said simply. He looked at her. The lamp between them on the table was steady and warm. Outside, the June evening was soft and long, the sky still holding the last pale edge of daylight in the west. "Did anything happen while I was gone?" he asked. "The rooster finally figured out he could not get down from the water tower," she said. "Garrett had to get a ladder." Roy's face broke into a full smile at that, the one that changed the geography, the one that she had been hoarding like currency since the first time she saw it. "What finally did it?" "He sat up there for 6 hours looking increasingly embarrassed," she said, "and then Garrett went up and brought him down. He has been very quiet about the whole business since." Roy laughed, that real sound, and it rang in the kitchen and settled into the walls. There was a letter from San Antonio waiting for Roy. It had arrived 2 days ago while he was in Santa Fe, and she had put it on the front hall table without saying anything about it. She saw him find it when he passed through the hall after supper, saw him stop and look at it for a moment, his back to her. He picked it up and took it into the study. She gave him his privacy. She cleaned up the kitchen and went to her room and read the book she had been trying to read for 2 evenings and could not concentrate on now either. An hour later she heard his knock at her door. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the frame. He was holding the letter. His expression was not weeping this time. It was something more complex. It was the look of a man on the other side of something. "He wrote back," Roy said. "James Aldridge." "Is it a good letter?" He looked down at the pages in his hand. "He did not know she had died. He says he has not known for 3 years and that he does not have words for what that is, not yet. He says he has been thinking about writing to her for 2 years but could not make himself do it." He paused. "He says he is glad I told him. He says he is grateful." Alma looked at him across the small room. "He is coming in August," Roy said. to see the place where she lived. He asked if that would be permissible. Of course it would be permissible, Alma said. Roy looked at her. His voice was quiet when he spoke again. You told me it was worth doing, he said, that evening in the kitchen. I told you it might be worth doing, she said. You decided it was. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on her small writing table threw soft light. You are a remarkable woman, Alma Underwood, he said. She felt the warmth of it move through her. She kept her expression composed. I am a housekeeper who was offered coffee, she said. That is where it started. No, he said, and his voice was very certain. It started before that. It started when you opened the curtains. She looked at him and did not look away. I need to tell you something, he said. All right, she said. He stepped slightly further into the room, enough that the lamplight reached him more fully. He was still holding the letter at his side. I am not a man who does this easily, he said. You should know that before I say it. I have not said anything like this in 4 years, and I am likely to say it badly. Say it anyway, she said quietly. I think about you when you are not in the room, he said. I have thought about you for weeks. I do not know when it started. I know that when I came back from Santa Fe today and rode up to the house, the first thing I thought was not that the trip had gone well or that the water rights were secure. The first thing I thought was that you were inside that house and I was glad to be back. He paused. That is not a small thing for me. I want you to understand that it is not a small thing. Alma set down her book. She stood up from the narrow bed. She was looking at him and he was looking at her, and the lamp burned steadily between them. Roy, she said, I have been falling in love with you since the evening you sat down at the kitchen table and let me pour you coffee. The expression on his face was something she would keep for the rest of her life. Not just relief, though there was relief in it. Not just warmth, though there was that too. It was the face of a man who had not let himself be open in a very long time, opening. Fully, truly, in a way that was frightening and inevitable at once. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, those large, scarred, work-worn hands, and he kissed her with the same quality that he did everything else, completely and without reservation, as if he had made a decision and would stand behind it entirely. She kissed him back with her whole self. They stood in the small room off the kitchen of the Double B Ranch on a warm June evening in 1878, and the walls of that cold, quiet house did not quite know what to do with the warmth that was in them. What followed was a courtship that was, like Roy Blackwell himself, unhurried and entirely genuine. He was not a man for grand gestures or flowery language, and Alma would not have wanted either from him. What he gave her instead was his attention, which was a complete and serious thing when he aimed it at her, and his trust, which she understood was the harder of the two for him to give. He began showing her the ranch in a way that was different from a man showing an employee the scope of the property. He showed it to her the way you show someone a thing that matters to you, explaining the history of the land grant, pointing out the places where the land changed character, telling her about the dry creek bed in the northwest corner that only ran in heavy rain years, and what it did to the grazing when it did. She rode with him twice a week on the mornings she could spare from the house, on a steady sorrel mare named Patience that the name suited absolutely, and she learned the Double B the way you learn a piece of music you intend to play for a long time. One evening he showed her the place on the east boundary where the water ran, the source of the web dispute, a clear and steady little creek that moved between cottonwoods and smelled cold even in the summer heat. He stood beside it with his hands in his pockets, and she stood next to him, and he said, quietly, Clara is buried on the hill above the house. Not here. I want you to know that this place is just the land to me. The water rights matter because the ranch matters, not because of any other reason. Alma understood that he was telling her something carefully, something about boundaries and spaces, about what was his grief and what was separate from it. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to be Clara, he said. I would not do that to you or to her memory. What I am asking you, if I am asking you anything, is to be here. As yourself. As Alma Underwood. He paused. Who opens curtains and argues with me about cut flowers and apparently has a theory about roosters and dignity that I think about more than I should." She laughed at that, a real laugh, and he smiled at her with the full geography of his face and reached over and took her hand simply, standing beside the creek in the cottonwood shade. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her hair. They stood there until the shadows lengthened and the heat went out of the day. James Aldridge arrived at the Double B on a Wednesday morning in early August. He came by stage to Harlan Creek and rode out in the buckboard with Garrett, who had gone to collect him, and Alma watched from the front porch as the buckboard came up the road. He was a man in his mid-40s with Clara's coloring, the dark hair and the light eyes, and a face that had been doing something difficult for a long time and showed the weight of it. He stepped down from the buckboard and looked at the house for a moment before Roy came out onto the porch. The two men looked at each other. There was a lot in that look. 3 years of not knowing, 4 years before that of estrangement, a shared grief that had been sitting alone in separate places until a letter crossed the territory and brought it together. Roy stepped off the porch and extended his hand, and James Aldridge took it. "I am glad you came," Roy said. "I am glad you wrote," James said. Alma brought them in and fed them and let them talk in the sitting room with the curtains open and the morning light coming in across the floorboards. She stayed out of it, attending to the kitchen, understanding that whatever needed to happen between them needed to happen without witnesses. She heard their voices, low and sometimes long-paused, for most of the morning. At midday she brought in coffee and found them both quiet but not uncomfortably so, the way two people are quiet when they have said the most important things and are settling into the space that makes. James Aldridge looked at her with Clara's eyes and said, "Roy tells me this place is warmer than it used to be." "The curtains were the first thing," she said, and she said it lightly, but he understood what she meant. "Good," he said simply, "good." He stayed for 4 days, and on his last evening he sat at the kitchen table while Alma cooked supper and Roy finished the evening checks on the horses, and he said to her without preamble, "She would have liked you." Alma kept her hands on the task in front of her. "I would have liked to know her," she said. "She was stubborn," he said. "Like you. She did things in her own way and did not explain herself much." He was quiet. "The fight between us, the real one, was my fault. I want you to know that because Roy does not know the full of it. I was unkind to her about the marriage when she first told me. I said things I could not take back and she did not forgive them, and I did not ask for forgiveness properly, and we both let it go too long." He rubbed his jaw. "4 years is too long, and then there was no time left." "There is still you," Alma said gently. "There is still the time you have." He looked at her. That is the kind of thing she would have said, he told her. He left the next morning. He and Roy shook hands again at the buckboard, and this time it was different from the first handshake, less weight in it and more substance, the difference between meeting and knowing. They would write, Alma understood. Not frequently, perhaps, but they would write. The summer moved through July and into August, and the ranch had the good, busy quality of a place running properly, the calves growing out, the south pasture recovering from the drought of the previous year, the water dispute with Webb settled and quiet. Garrett had taken on a new hand named Dobb, a young man from Texas who was enthusiastic and not yet skilled but learning fast, and who had an endearing habit of asking Alma after every meal if there was anything he could do to help, which she always declined but appreciated. Roy asked her to marry him on a Sunday morning in late August. He did not do it dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, and she would have been suspicious of him if he had been. They were in the kitchen after breakfast, which had been a slow and pleasant affair because Sundays were the one morning when there was no urgency, and he was at the table with his coffee and she was washing up, and he said, "Alma." She turned. He was looking at her over his cup with those dark, complicated eyes, and she knew immediately from the quality of his voice that something was about to happen. "Marry me," he said. Not a question precisely, though it had the shape of one. More like a man stating something true and asking her to confirm it. She dried her hands on the dish towel. She walked to the table and stood in front of him. He looked up at her, and the morning light was coming through the open curtains, and the house was warm and alive in a way it had not been when she arrived. "Yes," she said. "Roy Blackwell, I will marry you." He stood up and took her hands and kissed her properly, with the morning sun on both of them, and she held on to his hands and thought that she had come to this territory with $1.32 and the determination not to be afraid. And here she was, in the best place she had ever been. They were married in October at the church in Harlan Creek, which was a small and practical building that suited them both. Delphine Holt cried, which Alma found very touching because Delphine was not a woman who appeared to cry easily. Garrett stood up with Roy and wore the most expressively uncomfortable suit Alma had ever seen on a man who was clearly much happier in work clothes. James Aldridge had written to say he was sorry he could not make the trip for the wedding but was glad in his whole heart, and Roy had read the letter twice before folding it carefully and putting it in his breast pocket. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Matthias Cole, a spare and earnest man who conducted the proceedings with genuine warmth and whose voice rose slightly on the word love, in a way that made it sound like he personally believed it every time. Roy said his vows in his particular way, completely and without performance, looking directly at her, and Alma said hers the same way. And when the Reverend pronounced them married, Roy kissed her in the church in front of the assembled 30-odd people of Harlan Creek with the contained thoroughness that was, she had come to understand, his version of extravagance. The town gave them a supper at the hotel, because small western towns in 1878 understood the importance of a good meal as celebration and community bond. And Alma sat at a long table and ate and laughed and watched Roy, who was not naturally comfortable in gatherings, managing the evening with a grace that she knew was partly for her, and loved him for it. Walking back from the hotel to where their horses were tied, with the October stars overhead and the night cool and full of the scent of sage, Roy took her hand and did not let go of it until they reached the horses. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was not the sort of thing Roy Blackwell usually asked, and which told her something about the particular quality of the evening. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her in the starlight. "Yes," he said. "It surprises me how much." They rode home to the Double B in the dark, and the house with its lit windows looked like a different thing than it had in April. It looked like a house with someone in it. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was a hard one for the territory, with snowfall that came early and stayed long, and the ranch work in those months had a relentless quality that tested everyone on the property. Roy worked longer days than usual, and Alma kept the house warm and the food steady and rode out herself twice to help check fences when the wind had been particularly bad. She was not a fragile woman, had never been, and Roy had understood that early, and he treated her accordingly, as a partner in the management of the place rather than someone to be sheltered from it. She learned to read the land in winter, which was different from summer, harder and more honest in its beauty. She learned to look at the sky in the morning and understand what it meant for the day. She learned the name and personality of every horse in the barn, and some of the cattle, though the cattle were harder to distinguish individually, and Roy laughed at her for trying. There were hard days. There was a week in January when a heifer died in difficult calving, and Roy came in at midnight covered in mud and exhausted in a deep-down way that was past tiredness, and she met him in the kitchen with a towel and hot water and something hot to eat and did not say anything unnecessary, and he sat at the table and recovered in increments, and after a while looked up at her and said, "I do not know how I did any of this before you." "You did it alone," she said, "which is harder." "Yes," he said, "it is." In February of 1879, Alma told Roy she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, which was where the important things between them always seemed to happen, on a gray morning when the snow was coming down outside and the stove was going strong and the coffee was fresh. She told him simply, looking at his face to read it honestly. He sat very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her in his arms and held her, which was not a thing he did lightly or casually, and she could feel the way he breathed, deep and uneven. "All right," he said, his voice against her hair. "All right. You are pleased?" she asked. "Alma," he said. He held her slightly away so he could look at her face. His eyes were bright in a way she had seen very few times and recognized as his version of overwhelming feeling. "I am more than pleased. I did not know I was allowed to want this again." She held his face in her hands. "You are allowed everything good," she told him. He turned his face into her palm and pressed his lips against it. Spring came slowly that year, and when it arrived it had the quality of a great relief, the snow pulling back from the land inch by inch, the creek running high and noisy with snowmelt, the first green showing in the yellow grass. The calving season brought the Double B through its busiest stretch, and Alma continued working alongside the household duties with the matter-of-fact approach she brought to everything, declining Roy's increasingly anxious suggestions that she rest more and do less, until the conversations became one of their recurring small arguments, which always ended the same way, with Roy surrendering to her stubbornness, and Alma making some modest concession that satisfied no one but kept the peace. Garrett watched these exchanges with the serene expression of a man who had seen worse things, and found this particular kind of disagreement entirely reassuring. Dobb, the young hand from Texas, had been doing increasingly well through the winter, learning fast and developing the solid competence of someone who was genuinely suited to the work. Roy had given him more responsibility with the horses, which he was particularly good with, and the young man had responded to the trust with a focus and dedication that made him valuable. The water dispute with Webb flared briefly again in the spring, when Webb attempted to run a lateral ditch from the creek during the snowmelt, which would have diverted a significant amount of water onto his east pasture during the critical period. Roy rode to Webb's ranch himself, which he very rarely did, and had a conversation that Alma did not know the content of, except that Roy came back from it with the particular expression he got when something had been resolved through sheer force of his being Roy Blackwell, which was a combination of quiet certainty and absolute unmovability that most men found it easier to accommodate than oppose. The ditch was not completed. Webb did not try again that season. "What did you say to him?" Alma asked that evening. "I reminded him of the land office ruling," Roy said, "and I showed him the survey documents. That was all." He looked at her over the supper table with the ghost of a smile. "I may have mentioned the cost of a court proceeding," he said, "in some detail." "Roy Blackwell," she said. "The man needed facts," he said. "I gave him facts." She shook her head and he looked very slightly pleased with himself, which was one of her favorite expressions on him. Their son was born in September of 1879 on a clear autumn morning when the air was sharp and the cottonwoods were turning gold along the creek. He was healthy and loud from the first moment, which Alma found encouraging and Roy found slightly overwhelming in the best possible way. The midwife from town, a capable woman named Ora Marsh, attended the birth with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and Roy was not in the room but was on the other side of the door for the entire proceeding, which Alma found both touching and slightly funny given how completely unflappable he was in every other circumstance. When Ora opened the door and told him he could come in, and he saw Alma sitting propped against the pillows with the baby, the expression on Roy Blackwell's face was something Alma had never seen before and would never forget. All the walls down, all of it present, the enormity of it plain and unguarded on his face. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms and he held the boy with those large scarred hands with a terrible and beautiful carefulness. "What do we call him?" she asked. Roy looked down at the baby for a long moment. "William," he said, "after my father." "William Blackwell," she said. "Yes." She reached over and rested her hand on Roy's arm. He looked up at her with eyes that were very full. "Thank you," he said. It was not a sufficient thing to say for what he meant and they both knew it. "Thank you," she said back. meaning the same insufficient thing that contained everything. The years at the Double B had a rhythm to them that Alma came to understand was its own kind of richness. Not the dramatic richness of great events, though there were events, but the quieter richness of a life built steadily and well in a place that suited the people building it. William called Will from the first week because William seemed too formal for a baby who expressed his opinions loudly, grew into the kind of child the ranch suited naturally, curious about animals and equipment, and the names and habits of everything, following Roy around from the moment he could walk steadily, listening to everything that was said to him with those dark, serious eyes that were entirely Roy's. Roy was with the boy in a way that Alma recognized as deliberate, as a man consciously giving something that mattered to him. He explained things to Will carefully and seriously, not talking down to him, but genuinely including him, and Will responded to this by absorbing information at a rate that sometimes made Alma wonder what was happening in that small head. The town of Harlan Creek had warmed to Roy Blackwell in ways that were noticeable over those years, the nodding on the street becoming conversations, the conversations becoming the kind of community engagement that a rancher in good standing has with a town that depends on the trade his operation brings. Roy was not suddenly a gregarious man. He would never be that. But the wall that had been visible and impassable was replaced by something more like a door, closed but with the knowledge that it would open. Delphine Holt had become a genuine friend to Alma, the kind of friend who brings food when there is a new baby and notices when you are tired before you say so. She and Alma had the easy shorthand of women who have grown to know each other well in a place where the choices for female company are limited, and who have found that the limitation does not matter when the company is genuinely good. Garrett remained the steady center of the ranch's working life, and Alma had come to think of him the way she imagined an older brother might feel, someone whose presence was so reliably there and so essentially itself that you stopped noticing it except when you imagined its absence, which was unbearable. In the spring of 1881, Dobb got into trouble. He was 23 by then and had been doing well on the ranch, but he had a weakness that Roy had been aware of for some time, which was a tendency to trust the wrong people when he was off the property. He had gotten mixed up with a man from Albuquerque named Pierce Lacey, who was running a small scheme involving cattle that were not his, and Dobb had been involved in moving some of those cattle without fully understanding what he was doing, or so he said. Roy learned of it through a deputy who came out to the ranch, a young man named Clifton Harding, who had the awkward air of someone doing a job he did not particularly enjoy. He told Roy what he knew, and Roy listened to all of it without expression, thanked him for coming, and said he would look into it. He and Dobb had a conversation that Alma was not present for but heard enough of to understand its shape. Roy's voice was level and quiet throughout, which was more serious than if he had been angry. Dobb's voice was miserable and defensive, and then simply miserable. Afterward, Roy came into the kitchen and told Alma that Dobb had cooperated with the deputy and given testimony against Lacey, and that the deputy had indicated this would likely keep Dobb out of the worst of the legal consequences. Roy had paid for a lawyer in Harlan Creek to represent him. He was a fool, Roy said without particular heat, but not a dishonest man. There is a difference. What happens to him? Alma asked. He will have to appear before the circuit judge. With the testimony and the lawyer, it is likely a fine and a warning. Roy poured himself a glass of water from the pump. I have told him he can stay on at the ranch if the judge permits it, on the condition that he has no further contact with Lacey or anyone of that type. You are keeping him on, Alma said. Roy looked at her steadily. He is 23 years old and was taken advantage of by someone who knew how to do it. Yes, I am keeping him on. Alma looked at her husband, this man who was said to be the cruelest rancher in the territory, who had paid for a foolish young man's lawyer and was keeping his position open, and she thought that the people who spread those stories had never had the chance to know Roy Blackwell at all. The judge levied the fine. Dobb paid it from his wages over 6 months. He never gave Roy cause to regret the decision. It was the winter of 1881 going into 1882 when Alma discovered she was expecting again. She was 30 years old by then, and Will was 2.5 and loud and wonderful, and the double B was prospering in the careful, solid way that well-managed ranches prosper in a good stretch of years. She told Roy the same way she had told him the first time, in the kitchen, watching his face. He smiled first before he said anything. A real, full smile without the surprise that had been in it the first time, just the warmth. "Good," he said simply, and came around the table to hold her. "Good," she agreed into his shoulder. The second child was a daughter born in August of 1882, and they named her Eleanor, after Alma's mother, which was Roy's suggestion, made quietly one evening a few months before the birth. Alma had looked at him when he said it and had not been able to speak for a moment, and he had said nothing more, understanding what she was feeling. Eleanor arrived with less noise than Will had, but looked at the world from the start with an alertness that suggested she was making assessments, and Alma recognized this as a family trait on her side and loved the baby for it fiercely. Will, who had been prepared for the arrival, but seemed to have formed his own private theory about what a sibling would be like, examined Eleanor with the solemn concentration of a child doing serious evaluative work, and ultimately declared that she was very small but acceptable, which Roy reported to Alma with a perfectly straight face while clearly being tremendously amused. The territory was changing during those years in ways that were visible and consequential, even in a place as settled and self-sufficient as the Double B. The railroads were pushing further into New Mexico, which changed the economics of cattle ranching significantly, opening markets that had not existed when Roy first built up the operation, but also bringing in more people, more claim jumping, more complexity. Roy watched these developments with his characteristic calm and adapted where adaptation made sense and held firm where it did not. He made a decision in 1883 to contract directly with a buyer in Albuquerque for his beef, cutting out the middlemen who had been taking a significant portion of the margin, and it cost him 2 seasons of uncertainty before the direct contract proved its value. Alma had supported the decision from the beginning and spent those 2 uncertain seasons doing what she had always done, keeping things steady, managing the household budget with the tight precision that times of uncertainty required, never suggesting by word or manner that she doubted the outcome. When the contract proved out and Roy came in from town one evening with the look of a man who had been proven right, he sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I want you to know that I could not have done that without you." "You were the one who made the decision," she said. "I made it knowing you were behind it," he said. "That is not a small thing. To make a hard decision, you need to know someone will stand with you regardless of how it goes. You gave me that." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You have given me the same thing," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat at the kitchen table in the October evening with the lamp between them and the children asleep upstairs and the ranch settling into the night around them. And it was an ordinary evening and an extraordinary one at once, because that is what a good life is made of. James Aldrich came twice more in those years, once in 1881 and once in 1883, and each visit settled something further between him and Roy. They were not men who spoke easily about feeling, but they had the letter between them and what it meant, and that was a foundation that turned out to be enough. On the 1883 visit, James met Will and Eleanor and spent a long time with both of them in the way of a man who does not have children of his own and is discovering what he has been missing. And when he left, he shook Roy's hand and looked at Alma and said, "She would be so glad." Alma thought about that for days after. Not with sadness, but with the particular quality of gratitude you feel when you understand that a life has turned in a good direction, and you have played some small part in it. In the late summer of 1884, when Will was nearly 5 and Eleanor was 2, Alma was in the garden she had planted along the south side of the house, an ambitious thing by territory standards with actual vegetables and herbs, and even some ambitious flowers, when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to see a rider coming at speed. It was one of the men from the spread to the north, a young fellow whose name she knew was Pedro Ruiz, and he was riding hard in a way that meant something was wrong. She was already moving toward the house to find Roy when the rider pulled up in the yard, and she heard him say, between catching his breath, that there was a grass fire moving from the west on the dry wind, and it was heading toward the Connolly claim, which was a smaller operation with a family of 3, and the Connolly hands were short because 2 of them had gone to town that morning. Roy was on his horse in 7 minutes, Garrett and Dobb and 2 other hands with him, and Alma watched them go with the practical heart of a ranch woman who knows that fire in dry country in late summer is the most serious thing, and who knows also that her husband is the most capable man she has ever known. She organized things on the home end with the efficiency that was second nature to her, making sure the water supply was accessible, checking the fire break that Roy had cleared around the home buildings 2 years prior precisely against this kind of situation, keeping the children inside with the help of Rosa, the young woman who helped with the children on busy days, and waiting. They were back by nightfall. The fire had been stopped at a natural break in the scrub before it reached the Connolly buildings, and the Connolly family had lost some fencing and an outbuilding but nothing worse. Roy came home smelling of smoke with a minor burn on the back of his right hand that was already being minimized in his description of it, and that Alma cleaned and bandaged with focused care while he sat at the kitchen table and drank water. "The Connolly children?" she asked. "Safe," he said. Margaret Connolly had gotten them to the creek. She knew what to do. Alma nodded, finishing the bandage. "Will you check on them tomorrow?" "Yes," he said. And then, because he was Roy, he added without further elaboration, "We will bring food." She looked up at him. He was watching her with tired eyes and the smoke-darkened face, and she loved him completely in that moment. This man who had been called cruel by people who did not know him, who rode toward other people's fires and brought food to their neighbors, and paid the lawyers of foolish young hands and wrote letters to estranged brothers-in-law. This man who had wept in a study over a letter he had never sent and had let himself be found. She pressed her hand briefly against his cheek. He covered it with his bandaged one. "Go to bed," she said. "In a minute," he said. He stayed at the table long enough to see Will, who had crept downstairs on hearing the horse's return, and had a short, serious conversation with his son about the fire and what had happened, explaining it in the level way he explained everything, including what had gone right and what the risks had been, treating the child as someone entitled to accurate information. Will listened with those dark eyes and said, "Were you scared?" Roy looked at his son for a moment. "Yes," he said. Fire is something to be scared of. Being scared of the right things and doing them anyway is what bravery is. Alma, watching from the kitchen doorway, thought that whoever had raised Roy Blackwell had done something right in him that had survived all the terrible years since. Will considered this answer with the gravity of a nearly 5-year-old doing philosophy. "All right," he said. "Good night, Papa." "Good night, Will." The seasons turned and the ranch grew and the family became more fully itself. Roy took on 2 additional hands in 1885 to manage the expanded herd, both of them recommended by Garrett and both of them good workers. The Double B was one of the most well-regarded operations in that part of the territory by then, not for its size, which was considerable but not exceptional, but for the quality of its management and the reliability of its product, which in the cattle business is worth more than size in the long run. The water dispute with Webb had been quiet for years, but in the spring of 1885 Webb died of a heart ailment, and his property was sold to a man from Colorado named Harrison Frost, who had entirely different ideas about water management, and a lawyer he brought with him who also had ideas. There was a tense few months while the new neighbor tested the boundary lines, and Roy maintained the same calm, document-backed position he had always maintained. And eventually the lawyer saw the land office ruling and the survey and advised Frost accordingly, and the dispute subsided before it had properly started. Roy told Alma that evening that the new neighbor had come to the fence line and introduced himself personally, and suggested they discuss the water rights like neighbors, and Roy had agreed, and they had worked out an informal arrangement that suited both operations, with the formal legal right remaining with the Double B, but a practical sharing of access during drought periods. "He is a reasonable man," Roy said. "Webb was not. This is easier. The territory is filling up," Alma said. "Reasonable men will matter more as it does." "Yes," Roy said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about the water tower. We need to expand it if we are going to manage the additional stock through a dry year." "The money is there," she said. She kept the books now, had for 3 years with Roy's full confidence, and she knew the ranch finances as well as he did. "With what we made on last fall's sale, we can manage the tower and still have a reserve." Roy nodded slowly. "Do it then." She looked at him. He looked back. "I mean," he said, with the slightly deliberate air he got when he was checking himself for old habits of solo decision-making, "I think we should do it if you agree." "I agree," she said, "and you are getting better at that." He made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a laugh. "You are relentless," he said. "Yes," she agreed cheerfully. "It is one of my best qualities." The water tower was expanded that fall and served the ranch well through 2 dry years running. In 1886, Alma became aware that Will, who was 7 by then, had formed a particular friendship with the son of one of the newer hands, a boy named Samuel whose family lived at the edge of the ranch property, in a small house Roy had built for the use of married hands. Samuel was the son of Marcus and Lucia Torres, who had come north from the Mesilla Valley, and the friendship between the boys was the natural and oblivious kind that children form before they have been taught to notice the distinctions that adults put on people. Alma was glad of it. She had thought about this, about who Will would grow up knowing and how he would understand the world, and she wanted him to grow up understanding it honestly. The territory in 1886 was a complicated place in this regard, with old tensions between the various people who occupied it, the Spanish and Mexican families who had been there for generations, the Anglo settlers moving in, the remnant Apache bands in the South who were in the last and most contested years of their resistance against the Army's effort to confine them to reservations. There was injustice everywhere in it if you were willing to look, and Alma was always willing to look. She talked to Roy about it one evening, about wanting Will to grow up with clear eyes about who people were and what was fair. Roy listened in the way he listened to things that mattered to him with his full attention. Then he said, "Marcus Torres is the best judge of a horse's condition I have ever met. He knew what was wrong with the gray before the horse showed any visible symptoms. I want Will to know a man by what he can do and what kind of man he is, not by where his family came from." "Good," she said. "That is what I hoped you would say." "He already knows it," Roy said. "He is your son as much as he is mine." She took his hand across the supper table. He squeezed it once firmly. Samuel Torres and Will Blackwell grew up together on and around the Double B, as naturally as the scrub cedar grew along the fence lines. 2 boys who argued and collaborated and got into the predictable small troubles of childhood and grew out of them together. And the Torres family became part of the extended life of the ranch in the same quiet, permanent way that Garrett had been part of it for years. Eleanor, meanwhile, was making herself known as a person in ways that were consistently surprising and consistently specific. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a particular quality of absolute certainty about her own opinions that both her parents recognized from different sources. She had decided at the age of 3 that she preferred being outdoors to being indoors, and had maintained this position through every subsequent attempt to interest her in quieter activities. She followed Roy to the barn with the same relentlessness that Will had at the same age, and seemed to be conducting her own systematic education about the horses. Roy's relationship with Alina was, in its way, the clearest window Alma had ever had into her husband's heart. He was patient with her in a way that had its own particular quality, not the patience of tolerating a child's foolishness, but the patience of a man who genuinely respected what he was watching grow. He explained things to her the same way he explained them to Will, completely and seriously. And Alina received this information with the same focused absorption, and then went off and acted on it in ways that frequently required Roy to start the explanation over in a slightly modified form. The year Will turned 8, Roy gave him a horse of his own. It was a carefully selected animal, a steady chestnut gelding with a calm temperament and enough spirit not to be boring, and Roy presented it with the matter-of-fact ceremony that was characteristic of him, which meant a brief explanation of the horse's qualities and the responsibilities that went with the ownership, and Will received this with the seriousness it deserved. But Alma saw Roy's face when Will rode the chestnut across the yard for the first time with his back straight and his hands steady, and she saw what was in it, the full weight of pride and love and the specific particular joy of a man who had thought he might never have this. She found him at the fence that evening, leaning on the top rail watching the chestnut in the paddock. She stood beside him and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood watching the horse in the long September light. "Are you happy?" she asked, which was the same question she had asked on their wedding night. "Alma," he said, the same way he had said her name in the small room off the kitchen the first time he told her he thought about her, with the entire weight of everything in that one word. "I am," he said, "beyond what I expected, beyond what I had any right to expect." She turned her face up, and he kissed her in the September evening with the chestnut horse watching from the paddock and the ranch around them in the long golden light, and the children's voices carrying from somewhere near the barn. In the early winter of 1887, a letter arrived from James Aldridge that was different in character from the others. James had not been well, he said. Not critically, but the kind of not well that a man in his mid-50s experiences as a message about the nature of time. He was thinking about things. He had been thinking about Clara, and about the years they had lost, and he wanted to say, while there was time and health enough to say it, that Roy's letter in 1878 had changed his life in a direction he was grateful for. That the 4 visits to the Double B had given him something he had not known he needed. That the children and the life he saw there had made him understand, in a way he had not before, what Clara had chosen and why she had chosen it. Roy read the letter at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning when the snow was coming down outside, and Alma watched his face as he read. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a while. "He is all right," he said finally. "He says it is not serious, but he wanted to say things while he could." "Should we go see him?" Alma asked. Roy considered. "In the spring," he said. "When the roads are better, we could take the children." She smiled at that. "All right, in the spring." They went to San Antonio in April of 1888, the 4 of them, which was an adventure of significant proportions for Will, who was 8.5 and had never been on a train, and for Alina, who was 5 and had developed strong opinions about what constituted acceptable seating arrangements in a railway car. James Aldridge met them at the San Antonio station with Clara's eyes, and a face that had aged but looked somehow lighter than it had on his last visit to the Double B. He looked at the children for a long moment and then at Roy and Alma and said, "Good Lord, look at them." Will shook his hand with the serious adult manner that Roy had evidently modeled effectively, and Alina examined James with the frank assessment of a 5-year-old, and said that he had funny gray eyebrows, which Roy addressed immediately, and Alma suppressed a smile behind her hand. They spent 4 days in San Antonio, which was large and busy and full of the noise and activity of a growing Texas city in 1888. James showed them the things worth seeing, took the children to a market where Alina acquired a small carved wooden horse that she refused to set down for the remainder of the trip, and had long evening conversations with Roy on his back porch that Alma left them to. Sitting with the children in the parlor, or exploring the neighborhood while the two men talked the way men talk when they have known loss and found, against expectation, something on the other side of it. On the last evening, James found a moment with Alma alone while Roy was helping the children into their coats in the hallway. "That letter he sent," James said quietly. "I know you were the reason he sent it." "He had written it himself," she said. "I only told him it was worth sending." James shook his head slowly. "It took more than that. He was not a man who asked for help with grief. Whatever you gave him, it was more than a suggestion to mail a letter." She looked at James Aldridge with Clara's eyes watching her and said, "He gave me as much." James nodded, and the understanding between them was complete. They rode the train back to New Mexico with Will asleep against Roy's shoulder and Alina curled in Alma's lap with the carved horse held against her chest, and the Texas plains moving past the window in the long late afternoon light. And Alma thought that she had asked only for wages and a room, and been given all of this. The years continued, as years do, in their particular and irreplaceable way. Will grew into a young man who was his father in some ways. The seriousness, the capability, the directness, and his mother in others. The warmth, the humor, the willingness to open a door rather than wait for someone else to open it. He was 13 when he began working the ranch in earnest alongside Roy and Garrett. Not as a child helping, but as someone learning a trade that would be his. And the pride Roy took in this was visible in the way he and his son worked together, side by side on the same fence line or the same horse selection. The older man showing and the younger watching, and then doing, and the exchange between them having the quality of something being passed across time. Alina, at 10, had finished her evaluation of the horses and moved on to an evaluation of the books in the study, which she conducted with the same focused seriousness. She read everything available to her, and then began asking Alma and Roy for more, which led to a correspondence with a bookseller in Santa Fe who sent quarterly shipments to the Double B that Alina went through at a rate that kept the correspondence active. Roy found her asleep in the study chair one evening with a copy of a natural history text open on her lap, and carried her upstairs without waking her, and came back down and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Alma with an expression she had learned to read as the particular kind of overwhelmed he got when his children did something that revealed them as fully themselves. "She is going to need a proper education," he said. "She is," Alma agreed. "The school in Harlan Creek is not going to be sufficient much longer." "No," he looked at her with the measuring look he got when he was working out something complicated. "There is a school in Santa Fe, a good one. A woman named Hatch runs it. Delphine mentioned it last year." "I know the one," Alma said. "I have been thinking about it for 6 months." He exhaled. "Of course you have." A pause. "She is 10. We have a few years yet," Alma said. "But we should write to Mrs. Hatch and understand what they offer." He nodded slowly. "Yes." And then, because he was Roy, he added, "She is going to argue about going." "Enormously," Alma agreed. "She gets that from you," he said. "She absolutely does not," Alma said firmly, and he laughed. Garrett, who was 62 in 1890 and had been foreman of the Double B for more years than most of the current hands had been alive, announced at the end of that year that he was retiring. He said it the way Garrett said everything, directly and without drama, to Roy in the barn one evening, and Roy came inside afterward and told Alma, and she saw in his face the acknowledgement of how much that meant, how much Garrett had been part of everything. They gave Garrett the small house on the east edge of the property to live in, free and clear, with the deeds drawn up properly, so that it was his regardless of what happened to the Double B. Roy did this without Garrett asking for it or expecting it. And Garrett, who was not a demonstrative man, received it with a kind of stillness that communicated more than words would have. Dobb took over as foreman, which was exactly right, and the transition was smooth in the way that things go smoothly when they have been prepared for, whether consciously or not. The Double B in the early 1890s was everything Roy had built it to be and more than he had expected it could become. The cattle operation was strong and well regarded. The land was in good condition, maintained with the care that Roy brought to everything he owned. The house that had been cold and dark when Alma arrived in April of 1878 was now fully, deeply alive, filled with the noise and activity of a family that had grown into itself. On an evening in March of 1892, Alma was sitting on the front porch in the last of the day's warmth, watching the light go golden over the long flat grass, and Roy came out and sat in the chair beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and the quiet that between them now was entirely comfortable, full rather than empty. Will was 15 and out in the south pasture with Dob for a late check on the herd. Eleanor was inside with her books. Garrett was probably on his own porch a quarter-mile away. The ranch was settled for the evening. "I have been thinking about the letter," Roy said. She looked at him. "Not the one to James," he said. "Not that one." He looked out over the grass. "The fact that I could not send it when I should have, that I waited too long. That is not something to punish yourself for still," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know that now. I was thinking about it differently." He turned to look at her. In the long light his face was the face she had been watching for 14 years, the deep eyes and the square jaw, and the lines that were different from the ones he had carried when she first arrived, softer now, or rather, not softer but more honestly placed, the lines of a face that had been lived in properly. "I was thinking that if I had sent it when I should have, and if I had not put it in the box and then spent 3 years going cold, you would have found a different house when you came." She understood what he was saying, that the chain of things that had brought her to that kitchen table on that particular evening was made of his grief and his mistakes and his long silence. "I know," she said. "I am not grateful for Clara dying," he said carefully. "I want that to be clear." "It is clear," she said. "But I am grateful for everything since," he said, "for you finding me in the middle of it, for whatever it was that made you knock on that door instead of walking away." She reached over and took his hand. His hand, still large and scarred and work-worn, held hers with the absolute certainty of a man who has found the thing he means to hold. "You were worth finding," she said. "That is all." He raised her hand and kissed the back of it, which was not something Roy Blackwell did casually or frequently, and which meant, as most of his infrequent gestures did, exactly everything. The porch held them in the evening light, and the ranch lay around them full of its working life, and the stars were beginning, faintly, to show themselves in the eastern sky. Will came in from the south pasture at dusk and found them on the porch, and said with the combination of information and mild teenage mystification that characterized his observations of his parents, "Are you two just going to sit there all evening?" "Yes," Roy said. "All right," Will said, accepting this as reasonable, and went inside. Alma leaned her head against Roy's shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. The night came in soft and full of stars over the Double B, over the good land and the solid house and the barn where the horses stood in their stalls, over the creek running in the east boundary where the cottonwoods would be greening up in a few weeks' time, over the graves on the hill and the life below it, over all the years of building and breaking open and building again. Inside the house, Eleanor laughed at something she had read, a bright and startled sound that drifted out through the window and across the porch and into the evening. Roy smiled. Alma felt it against her hair. This was the thing, she thought. This was the whole of it. Not the great dramatic moments, though there had been those. Not the crisis and the decision and the turning point, though all of those had existed and mattered. It was the lamp in the kitchen on a difficult evening, and the coffee on the table and 2 cups instead of 1. It was the curtains open to let in the light. It was the letter sent, finally, after 3 years on a shelf. It was the man sitting down, and the woman who had knocked on the door, and everything that had grown from that small beginning like a creek running from a high source, finding its way through the stone, and the dry grass down to the long flat country where it could run freely. It was Roy Blackwell and Alma Underwood. who were Roy and Alma Blackwell now, who had come to each other out of loss and found that what they built together was stronger than either of them had been before. The rooster crowed once from somewhere in the yard, perhaps from the vicinity of the water tower, and Roy made a sound against her hair that was unmistakably a laugh, low and real and entirely his own. "Still," he said. "Always," she agreed. The night settled, the stars came fully out. The lamp in the kitchen window burned steady and warm, visible from the road, visible from a long way off, the way a lit window is visible to anyone who knows how to look for it. Anyone who has ever been in the dark and needed reminding that somewhere in the wide, cold country, there is a house with people in it who have chosen each other and will keep choosing, day after day, in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that choosing happens, for all the years they are given. For all the years they were given, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world in a lamplight window, and the sound of a good man laughing and the warm, solid weight of a life well lived, spreading out from that first knocked door like water finding level, like light finding its way through open curtains, like a letter sent at last to someone who needed it. The double B, the spring of 1878, the winter of 1892, all the years between and all the years ahead. Alma Underwood and Roy Blackwell, who had been the cruelest man in the territory to people who had never sat at his kitchen table, and who was, to the woman who had, the truest and most complete love she had ever known, and who would know it every morning for the rest of her life, waking in the house she had opened up and made warm, with the man she had found weeping and had not left alone in the dark. The stars went on overhead. The lamp burned on in the window. Everything was as it should be.